Russian President Putin has stalled time and time again on a ceasefire with Ukraine. Why? There's a dark secret Russia's leader doesn't want anybody to know. A Ukraine ceasefire will collapse Moscow from within. And it's not because Russia's economy will crumble, though that will be a huge issue. Putin's problem is that hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning to Russia will lead to epidemics of crime, substance abuse, unemployment, and domestic violence that will threaten the very fabric of Russian society. And it all starts with the ceasefire drama. On March 11, US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky released a joint statement in the wake of their meeting in Saudi Arabia. The two had come to terms on a ceasefire agreement. Ukraine and Russia would lay down their arms for 30 days to enable further peace negotiations. The agreement would be all-encompassing. No more ground assaults, no more airstrikes, no more battling it out in the Black Sea. The war would essentially come to an end for an entire month. The ball was laid squarely in Putin's court, and the Russian president's response was unsurprising. He said no to the initial ceasefire proposal, claiming he had a lot of questions that needed to be answered before he'd agree to Russia laying down its arms. What followed was several weeks of ceasefire drama. About a week after the US and Ukraine came to their agreement, Putin spoke to Trump on the phone. He promised an immediate energy infrastructure ceasefire, to which Ukraine agreed. Then Russia attacked Ukraine's energy infrastructure mere hours after that call. Ukraine responded in kind, and the status of that limited ceasefire is now up in the air. Right now, Putin and Trump are going back and forth on a ceasefire in the Black Sea. And again, Russia's leader is playing hardball. CNN reports that he told Trump that Russia would only agree to a Black Sea ceasefire if the sanctions imposed against Russia for invading Ukraine were lifted. Right now, Russia's economy is creaking under the weight of 24,311 sanctions, 7,384 of which are imposed by the US. Interestingly, March 26 brought with it news that Russia and Ukraine had both agreed to a limited ceasefire in the contested waterway. It appears that Russia has gotten its sanctions lifted. However, it's received an agreement from the US to help it gain access to fertilizers and other agricultural products to help its struggling farming industry. The US will also help Ukraine facilitate the returns of prisoners of war and civilian detainees, in addition to overseeing the reuniting of at least some of the reportedly 700,000 children Russia has snatched from Ukraine since Putin invaded. Still, it's not a full ceasefire. And if Putin's broken promises regarding energy infrastructure are anything to go by, neither Ukraine nor the US can trust Putin to keep his word about the recently negotiated Black Sea ceasefire. The odds are we'll see more Russian attacks in the Black Sea in the coming days, and the reason for that is simple. Despite all of his talk about wanting to arrange a ceasefire, the reality is that Putin doesn't want to end the Ukraine war. He's negotiating, he's delaying, and it's all in service of keeping the war that he started going for as long as humanely possible. Why? After all, Russia has suffered catastrophic losses against Ukraine over the last 3 years. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Putin's invasion has cost his country over 907,000 soldiers, lost to death, injury, or capture. Russia has lost over 10,000 tanks, more than 21,600 armoured fighting vehicles, and scores more equipment, all in return for taking control of just 20% of Ukraine's land. Surely, a ceasefire would give Putin a chance to regroup and either prepare for a renewed assault or finally bring his soldiers back to Russia. It would. But it's the bringing soldiers back to Russia part that's the problem for Putin. He's delaying and negotiating so much about a ceasefire because he knows that having hundreds of thousands of soldiers streaming back into his country will destroy Russia. Just how exactly could an end to the Ukraine war, temporary or otherwise, decimate Russia? The answer lies in a March 17 report published by Medusa. It points to a Telegram social media account named Fari Daily, which claims that discussions over a ceasefire agreement are stalling because Putin knows what's coming if Russia's soldiers return home. Domestic challenges will abound. Soldiers struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD will come home to a country that offers them no jobs and very little relief from the symptoms associated with their conditions. Crime will rise. Substance abuse will skyrocket. Through it all, Putin will have to deal with an influx of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who have violent tendencies and nowhere to unleash their aggression except against their own people. Massive domestic problems are on their way to Russia. According to Medusa, those problems can be broken into four main categories, starting with increased drug and alcohol abuse. Many returning soldiers are likely to turn to alcohol or drugs to cope with their physical and emotional trauma. The first year after the war will be a year of heavy drinking, according to an unnamed source from Russia's Labour Ministry. There are already signs that this is becoming a problem, according to the Medusa report. For instance, veterans returning to Russia from the front lines due to injuries or lost limbs are finding it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. They've started drinking heavily to cope with the stress and pain caused by what they see as their own society's abandonment of them and the issues they face. The truth is that drinking has always been a problem for Russia, both within and outside of its military. During the summer of 2023, multiple reports emerged that Russian troops were doing anything they could to mute the horrors of their experiences in the Ukraine war. Radio Free Europe, or RFE, reports that the Russian military was already in the grips of an addiction crisis by June 2023, and Russia's defense ministry was straining under the weight of the problem. The outlet quotes one Russian doctor in the Rostov region as saying, "The defense ministry has a whole department for psychological rehabilitation, but no real work for the large-scale treatment of PTSD is being done. But when a person sees all the horrors and filth of war, limbs ripped off, open wounds, death, a lot of them will try to mute them with drink and drugs. Otherwise, they would just go mad." RFE points out that mephedrone, which is a synthetic amphetamine referred to as salt in Russia, is already becoming a massive problem. Around 50% of patients being admitted to state clinics for addiction use the drug, and it's already making its way into the Russian military. Drug-related cases passing through Russia's military courts were already on the rise in 2023, with 3 convictions in March of that year alone. For context, both 2021 and 2022 saw just 3 convictions across the entire year, with 2020 having 1 drug-related conviction. Drinking is just as much of a problem. In a 2023 piece, The Hill points out that alcohol abuse is rampant in Russian society, with its tendrils extending to engulf senior politicians. Putin himself may not drink, or so he claims, but The Hill says that Kremlin officials have escalated from seeking solace in a glass of vodka to consuming an entire bottle during their working hours. And that's just the people making the decisions while trying to survive as part of Putin's authoritarian regime. The drinking problems run much deeper in Russia's military. Those problems started from the moment Putin's forces invaded, says The Hill. Drunkenness among the rank-and-file soldiers was common, resulting in Russia enforcing a ban on all alcohol sales in many of Ukraine's occupied territories. That only seems to have led to a rise in non-alcoholic drug use, including the previously mentioned salt, along with heroin, cannabis, and other opiates. In Russia itself, drug trafficking is already the second largest crime after theft, with the two being closely linked. Drug abusers will steal to get money to purchase what they need, creating a vicious cycle that's only going to get worse if a ceasefire is announced and thousands of already addicted Russian soldiers come streaming back home. In January 2024, the Moscow Times reported that alcohol dependency rose in Russia for the first time in over a decade. Between 2010 and 2021, the numbers had been declining, seeing a fall in first-time diagnosis of alcohol use disorder drop from 153,900 to 53,300. But in 2022, the number of diagnoses was 54,200. It's not a massive increase over the figures, but it sets a disturbing trend. Russia tried to claim that disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic was the cause of the problem, but numbers were still dropping during the height of that pandemic, and they only rose again in the year that Putin chose to invade Ukraine. And they're bound to skyrocket when alcohol and drug-addicted troops start coming back to Russia. The Jamestown Foundation offers its own statistics. It says that alcohol consumption in Russia rose to 2.3 billion litres in 2023. Those sorts of numbers haven't been seen since the tail end of the Soviet era, when Russia's empire was collapsing. That rise in addiction issues has an impact on the second reason why Russia will collapse if Putin agrees to a ceasefire: rampant crime. There are a few factors at play here. As the Jamestown Foundation points out, the 2023 rise in Russian alcohol consumption appears to correlate with a similar increase in violent crime. Russia recorded over 589,000 violent felonies in 2023, which is the highest figure on record since 2011. The foundation quotes Interfax as claiming that the Kremlin is blaming the violent acts on crimes committed by Ukrainian formations on Russian territory. Though, note this claim came over a year before Ukraine actually entered Russia's territory via its Kursk invasion. Medusa highlights the real problem here. The soldiers streaming back into Russia are some of the highest paid regular citizens in the country. Russia is currently spending about 8% of its federal budget on military pay, with soldiers now receiving monthly combat pay of around 200,000 rubles per month. That equates to between $2,000 and $3,000 monthly, which puts the soldiers within the top 15% of earners in the country. That's great for Putin to attract volunteers to his army, dangling a ruble-shaped carrot on the end of a stick, and many can't resist. The problem he faces is that those high-earning soldiers are unlikely to want to take regular lower-paying jobs once they return to Russia, and in the absence of the influx of cash that came from their military service, many of these soldiers, who are already accustomed to using violence to get their way, will resort to crime, and their quality of life will decrease. Medusa says that may lead to them taking out loans en masse, which they'll struggle to repay due to Russia's sky-high interest rates. It's only logical that some of Russia's returning soldiers will turn to crime to put food on the table and in some cases drug and alcohol into their systems. That issue is compounded by another problem. Many of Putin's soldiers are already criminals. In October 2024, Putin signed a law that allows criminal defendants who are on trial or appealing a previous conviction to avoid prosecution by joining the Russian military. They're essentially trading prison time for military service in what can only be seen as a desperate move by Putin to prop up his ailing forces. Russia's initial plans were to recruit 24,000 of its criminals, though a Russian defense military source claimed the number would likely be closer to 60,000. Both were wrong. By January 2025, the Kyiv Independent was reporting that Russia has already brought up to 180,000 convicts into its military, which is about half of the 300,000 to 350,000 prisoners in the country's prison by the end of 2024. And we're likely to see more criminals get recruited. The Moscow Times has reported that the number of individuals signing up for Russia's military has fallen fivefold since mid-2024, dropping from between 200 and 250 per day at that time to just 40 per day by February 2025. That's despite the massive wages and a $19,000 signing bonus being offered to recruits. Think about what all this means for Russia if a ceasefire goes ahead. The country may have to deal with previously non-criminal soldiers turning to violence due to low pay at home, addiction, and possibly the impact of PTSD. It might also have close to 180,000 former criminals, perhaps more if the war drags on, coming back home who are free to commit more crimes because they've exchanged their prison sentences for the time they served in the military. Putin is probably hoping that most of those criminals will end up dead on the Ukrainian battlefield. But the reality is that Russia faces a massive increase in crime as soon as its soldiers return. That brings us to the third problem Putin faces. Even if his returning soldiers are happy to accept much lower wages when they come back home, they may not have many options for work at all. Putin has already tried to mitigate this problem, at least in some areas. Workplaces are now required by law to keep jobs open for some of the Russian soldiers who left work to join the Russian military. That law will cause problems, according to Medusa, because some of Russia's combat veterans could become problem employees due to issues like drug abuse and criminality. The best case scenario is that they'll be paid to just stay away from the workplace, claims an unnamed source from Russia's defense ministry. But the problem goes much deeper than that. Russia's unemployment rate has been on a constant decline since November 2020. In that month, it was a little over 6%. 4 years later, Russia's unemployment rate, according to Moscow, is a tiny 2.3%. On the surface, that's good news for Russia's economy, with most of its people earning money to spend on goods and services. The problem arises when hundreds of thousands of soldiers stream back into Russia once the Ukraine war ends. Some of them may return to their old jobs, but there'll be many thousands more who discover that Russia's low unemployment rate means that there are basically no jobs to go around. This is already becoming a problem while the war is ongoing. On March 24, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia's job market has cooled so much in 2025 that the total number of vacancies in the country dropped by 15% during the early part of the year. The total number of vacancies is now just 2.3 million, and there have been drop-offs across the board. The number of accountancy positions available fell by 13.3% in January and February 2025, compared to the same period in 2024. Cashier job availability dropped by 9.1%, with HR specialists seeing a 9.6% decline in job opportunities. It's even worse in Russia's logistics sector, which saw declines of 25%. These are all signs that Russia's employers are cutting down on hiring as the country creaks under the economic strain Putin's invasion has placed upon it. While Russia's leader might be able to claim that jobs are still available in the country's defense industry, that won't be enough. Hundreds of thousands of Russia's soldiers may return to a country in which they can't find work. And as pointed out by the Jamestown Foundation, without work, those soldiers may turn to crime. Which leads to the fourth issue raised by Medusa's report, a rise in domestic violence. Wives in particular will be at high risk of facing violence from men with PTSD, claims the Fari Daily Telegram channel that Medusa quotes. That rise will also be accompanied by an increase in unplanned pregnancies, which is far removed from the steady increase in birth rates Russia is hoping to achieve. Domestic violence is already a problem on both sides of the Ukraine war. In February 2023, The Conversation reported on an October 2022 paper revealing that 25.9% of those who completed a survey likely had PTSD. Compare that to the 3.7% of men and 5.1% of women who have the affliction in the UK, and you can see the difference a war makes. That high PTSD rate seems to correlate with an 8% increase in domestic violence incidents and a 5% rise in forced sexual experiences in Ukraine. It's even worse in Russia. Even before Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, Russia was dealing with a domestic abuse crisis. In 2016 alone, there were 29,470 cases of violent crimes committed against a spouse. Though this number had declined to 14,860 by 2021, that was the year before Russia sent hundreds of thousands of its men into a brutal meat grinder war. Many of those men may return with PTSD, addiction issues, and an inclination toward violence that could lead to criminality, all of which is bad news for the harmonious domestic family units Russia wants to create. The reality is that Russia's domestic violence problems have only increased since the Ukraine war started. That's according to Lilia Vezhevatova, who coordinates the feminist anti-war resistance organization. Because of the war, the level of domestic violence increased, she says. As a rule, people returning from a war zone are very traumatized physically and psychologically. All of this translates into an increase in crimes against women and children in the family. The Barron's Observer points to isolated examples that have already happened. In April 2023, a 44-year-old senior sergeant in the Russian military stabbed his wife to death when he was on leave. August of the same year saw a man in Murmansk hit a woman in the face after asking her if she supported the special military operation. Women are not protected even before the war, says Natalia Baranova, also a feminist anti-war resistance. Now they're in the most vulnerable position and at risk. Violence in society will grow and is already growing. Everyone who returns from the war returns with a crippled psyche, with PTSD. There are risks of facing aggression everywhere, both at home and on the streets of the city. Add a rise in domestic violence to the other growing social issues, and you get a recipe for the collapse of Russian society if Putin agrees to any form of peace in Ukraine. That's why he won't do it. And even if he did, it's not like Putin would ever acknowledge the impact his invasion has on his own people. The veterans of Putin's war may ultimately end up adrift, much like those who came back from Russia's campaign against Afghanistan in the 1990s. Russia also has a critical shortage of professional rehabilitation specialists and career counselors who can help returning soldiers with their violence, PTSD, addiction, and job issues. The infrastructure isn't there. Putin isn't going to build it. And what it all adds up to is a generational problem that could rip the fabric of Russian society apart. But what do you think will happen if Putin signs a ceasefire and Russian soldiers start returning home? Will the situation be as terrible as these reports suggest? Is there any hope that Putin will actually end the Ukraine war? Let us know what you think in the comments, and please subscribe to the Military Show for more commentary about the impact the Ukraine war has on Russia. We're an independent source for news and information surrounding conflicts around the globe and greatly appreciate your support.